Hello and welcome to 15-Minute English Lessons, the channel where we teach you some English in 15 minutes. And today we are going to be talking about J.B. Priestley's epic 1946 play, An Inspector Calls, loved by English teachers all over the world, and with good reason, because it's a great play to study, and we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. This is probably going to end up being part one of several videos because it's a complicated play. And we only have 15 minutes, so we'll just break it down. But let's start. And what we're going to start with is this idea of where's it from? Well, it's from J.B. Priestley, and it's important that you remember to spell his name correctly because, let me tell you, I've been teaching this play for what feels like 6,000 or 7,000 years now, and people can't spell it. And the problem is, that's not really a huge problem in of itself, but it is right there on the front of the book. So what will happen is examiners will notice if you spell it right because most people don't, and that will put them in a good mood with you, and that might not be a bad thing. All right, Inspector Calls, written by J.B. Priestley, and he created this play specifically to make a point, more to a point about his socialist politics, and to make this point he invents Inspector Goole, and more about him later. His whole point really is summed up by the final speech. We do not live alone, we are members of one body. He was dismayed, and I think understandably so, with the way capitalism was going, and understood that really in order to benefit the world and make it a better one, we have to look after each other a bit more. This is a sentiment that was actually summed up quite well in 1961 at the inauguration of a certain US president.
If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich.
JFK there, sounding like Mayor Quimby from The Simpsons, and a terrible husband, but by all accounts a pretty good president, and I think we can probably agree with what he's saying there. So let's start with what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about form and structure and language, and we'll talk about the characters as well in this series of videos, and they're all very important things. Form and structure are massively important with regards to An Inspector Calls. It is going to be critical to talk about them really in any exam answer to the play, even a question about the characters, or perhaps especially. This is where the concept of the dramatic construct comes into play. All that means is some aspect of the play that was specifically designed for maximum dramatic effect, and everything about An Inspector Calls is a dramatic construct. We'll talk about the play a lot in various videos, but this is going to be a sort of introduction to that idea. So let's start with form. Now, obviously, the form of An Inspector Calls is a play, but obviously it's more complicated than that. There is more to it than that. It's also, by turns, a morality play, a cautionary tale, a murder mystery, although personally I don't think it is, a 3-act drama, a play of unity. On its own, there's not really much else you can say about the form, but if you contextualize it, then there is. Remember, saying it's a play doesn't help you very much, but the fact that a play is performed on a stage and therefore entrances and exits are specifically designed by the author for maximum effect, that will help you. The build-up, for example, where the audience suddenly realise that Eric is the father of Eva's child, is then crowned by Eric's sudden entrance, followed perfectly by the fall of the curtain. It's very, very strictly designed, and it's the sort of dramatic impact that can only be felt in a play by an audience. It's not just that, though. There are a lot of other touches as well. Look at how Priestley doesn't let Sheila leave the stage when the inspector puts Gerald through his paces. The way that Sheila reacts to Gerald's story lets the audience see that she is growing up before our very eyes. That's important. Think about all the different things that a play can give you. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But it's also important that we get a sense of the unities of time, place, and action, which are mentioned in Aristotle's Poetics and a key form of Greek theatre. The play takes place in real time, which adds suspense and tension and release, but it also solves a potential problem. Priestley hates Mr. and Mrs. Burling, so throughout the play we see them behave just as the horrendous people that they are, and that's done all the way through, and in fact, if anything, you could argue they get worse. However, Priestley likes, and needs his audience to like, more importantly, Sheila. So, by having the play set in real time, happening in one location, what happens is we only hear the story of what Sheila did. We don't see it, which would be quite a visceral impact. In fact, one of the early film versions of An Inspector Calls does show Sheila's interaction with Eva And it's harder to forgive her for that because we've seen it happen. And she is cruel, and she is spoiled, and she is a brat, and it's not nice. But by telling the story by herself, interspersed with her admissions of guilt and remorse, the impact of her behaviour is lessened, and the sorrow she feels for behaving that way is maximised. And that's important because we have to see that this is somebody that we are going to like and that we can learn to forgive. Play gives you an immediacy that's felt by a large number of people at the same time, and it can reach more than one class of people. Don't forget, not everybody knew how to read in 1946, but people knew how to listen and watch. And on top of that, the fact that the audience can see the characters gives Priestley the chance to show us so much more through body language and action than we could get from, say, a radio broadcast or a novel. And that's important too. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the structure of the play. Entrances and exits are really important in this play, and while they are technically dependent on it being a play, therefore a benefit of form, they're also a key element of structure. The characters are elements of structure, and they are structured as well. Mr. Burling's speech at the start of the play ensures that his character is undermined for the rest of the whole thing. Everything he says or does is greeted by disdain and mistrust by the audience. Sheila, meanwhile, is set up as the heroine. She's young, so she's got time to change and mature. Her crime, if you want to call it that, is committed through thoughtlessness, not malice, thus making her easier to forgive, if not easy. And her responses to just about everything in the play are very encouraging and very on message. The fact that she speaks warmly about people in Eva's position tells us a lot, as in fact does Eric's pithy but nevertheless accurate character description of her right at the start of the play, when he says, "She's got a nasty temper sometimes, but she's not bad really." That's a very simple line, but it actually holds the key to Sheila's character right there. The inspector doesn't arrive until Mr. Burling has established himself as the chief idiot of the play, which is important because then Mr. Burling has done that without any pressure, without any stress, without any kind of excuse, and he doesn't leave until he breaks Mrs. Burling, and Sheila is ready to assume his mantle. She becomes the kind of ersatz inspector after he leaves. Priestley basically shapes every aspect of the play to help this message hit home with the most forceful dramatic impact he can achieve. Now, those of you who've seen productions of the play might argue that he overdoes that sometimes, and some directors, I think, have probably overdone that. But he is trying to make a very, very important point, and it's even more important at the time that he's speaking. There's a whole video to be done looking at how the structure of the characters' entrances and exits guide us towards where Priestley wants us to be, and maybe I'll do that video sometime. Let me know if you would like it. Okay, this is too big a topic to really go into here, but let's talk a little bit about the way that Priestley makes his characters speak. See that? That's you, that is, if you don't talk about language in an exam about a play. Anyway, don't be like that. It's all right there in front of you. You can talk about it. Yes, look at the words, but look beyond them as well. Because remember, Priestley's stage directions are considerable, and they are still language as well. Sheila, we've mentioned this, speaks warmly about Eva. It's a stage direction, but it's still language, and it tells us a lot about her personality. At the end of the play, she flares up when she speaks to Mrs. Burling, which she would never have done at the start. And we know that because she doesn't do it at the start. Mrs. Burling says things that could wind her up, that could annoy her, that are out of touch, that are kind of, a little jarring. But she doesn't flare up this way because now we see that she's passionate. Now we see that she gets it at the end of the play. She understands the importance of what's going on here. And she doesn't at the start of the play. At the start of the play, she calls her mother Mummy, which is incredibly childish for somebody in their early 20s. But by the end of the play, she refers to her as mother, which is a much more grown-up term. And of course, it's not just Sheila. Mrs. Burling dismissively says, girls of that class. There's a lot you can talk about there. Whether it's the use of the infantilizing girls, which reminds us just how young Eva was. That class, which obviously highlights the class issues that England was facing at the time. And the fact that there's an ellipsis and she sort of trails off kind of implies that she thinks everybody just knows what she means. And I think probably everybody does know what she means. It's very dismissive, it's very dehumanizing, it's very snobby, it's very arrogant, it's very unpleasant. It's not nice to be around people who are like that. And then finally, the inspector in his last speech repeatedly uses the plural pronoun we, because it's not really an inspector talking to the Burlings. Those people don't exist. It's Priestley talking to us. He's got to make that point to us, and he can't come on stage and do it himself, but he can send the inspector on to make that point. And so he uses we in his final speech to emphasize the point that we are all in this together. Hey, look, it's Titanic again. Let's talk about Mr. Burling's dramatic irony. He talks about, at the start of the play, the Titanic being unsinkable and how there definitely won't be a war. And that instantly paints him as an idiot in the eyes of the 1946 audience. So the time when the play is set and the time when the play is produced are very, very important. So for the rest of the play, anything he says, and let's be honest, he says a lot as if it's just simple fact that anybody should understand, is completely undermined. It seems, instead of wisdom from an elderly gentleman or a man of the world who's seen things, it seems like an idiot who doesn't really know what he's talking about. So if he doesn't know what he's talking about with Titanic and the war, why would he know what he's talking about when it comes to politics or business? The air of complacency at the start of the play amplifies the inspector's impact on the family, and it's almost created entirely through language. You have to remember, in 1946, not only has the Second World War just finished, therefore people would have very recently lived through the horror of that war, but a lot of the audience would have been alive, if not part of, the First World War as well. Not to mention the Titanic sinking, which happened 2 years before the First World War began. So it's not just that we know these events happened in a kind of historical context when we look at it in 2023, but for the audience, it's a very visceral, realistic thing. Think of somebody set in a play set in 2018 saying there won't be a virus that comes in and closes the world for a couple of years. Ha ha ha. Of course there won't. Trust me. I know everything. As an audience in 2023, we know that that's stupid. Anyway, the language is important, very important, because of the effect it has on the audience. And Priestley was very keen that his language be delivered properly. You can see that when Sheila says, but they're not just cheap labour, they're people. And that's not italicized by accident. Priestley wants his actors to deliver this language in a very specific way, and she says this very early in the play because she is the character who can change. She's the one who is going to grow, and she's going to be the one who's going to be better, and she's the one who's going to lead the way for the younger generation. Hashtag feminism, hashtag leading the way, hashtag I'm with Hurling. Let's talk a little bit about characters in the time we have left. Again, this is something for another video really, but we'll start with this. It's impossible to predict about whom you might be asked in the exam, and there are plenty of sites that will give you very detailed breakdowns of who is who and all that. So here's a very brief review, if you like, and what we need to do is, with setting up the second video, is a specific focus on how these characters help Priestley. In order to make sure you write analytically, which is really what any mark scheme on any exam board is looking for, you have to avoid the old trap of saying things like, if only Sheila had done this, or if only Mr. Burling hadn't said that. You need to remember that Priestley created this play specifically, so it's pointless to say things like, Eva's death could have been avoided if only Sheila hadn't blah 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 blah. In the context of the play, that might be true, and Priestley might be saying that to us, but in fact, Sheila had to act the way that she acted, just as other characters had to act the way they did, because that's what Priestley wanted. If we're going to go through a full character arc, we have to remember that we need to see these characters develop and change at a certain point. And this is why the play is still being studied all these years later. There are teachers who will tell you, and I understand why they say it, that they did this for their GCSE and can't we find anything new to do? But the fact is, the same as the reason we study Shakespeare, the same reason we study old poetry, when it's so relevant to the world as that we currently inhabit, if it's done this well, it's a good thing to study. Okay, so Mr. and Mrs. Burling are awful pretty much all the way through, but they're not just, they start dislikably, but they end as characters we despise. And we'll talk about that in the next video. Eva, bless her, is not really mentioned very much. And as my class used to tell me, really it's all the maid's fault, because if she just hadn't answered the door, the inspector would never have arrived. I don't know if I totally agree with that, but I'm not going to focus on her role in my video about the characters. But that will be the next video that we do, and we'll unpack how each of these characters represents something different so that people in the audience can learn from them the way that Priestley wanted. Okay, so that is the end of our 15 minutes. Here's the part where I tell you, or ask you, sorry, with kindness in my heart and hopefully in yours, to click whatever button you're supposed to click and subscribe and leave comments and say, hey, that was great, or hey, that wasn't great, or why don't you do a video about this, or why don't you do a video about that, or I don't know, really whatever you want, because you are going to lead this whole channel. We are at your service, so please tell us what it is you need. In the meantime, all the very best. Take care, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.